At my son-in-law's promotion dinner, my pregnant daughter accidentally spilled a glass of water. Her mother-in-law slapped her hard and shouted, "My son should never have married you." When I stood up to protect my daughter, her father-in-law threw cold wine straight into my face, demanding I stay out of family business. I silently wiped my face, took my daughter's arm, and walked out into the night. An hour later, my phone rang. Everything began right then. "Welcome to Dad Family Revenge. I'm so grateful you're here. Which city or country are you watching from? Drop your location below so we can connect." Note: this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and learning. Any resemblance to actual people or settings is purely coincidental, but the valuable message remains. At the promotion dinner for my son-in-law, my daughter accidentally knocked over a glass of water. Her mother-in-law slapped her across the face and shouted, "My son should never have married you." When I stood up to defend my daughter, who was 3 months pregnant, her father-in-law coldly threw a glass of wine in my face. I wiped it off. I walked my daughter out. 1 hour later, my phone rang. Everything began. I want to tell you how that evening started, because beginnings matter. You cannot understand what I did in the weeks that followed unless you understand what I saw that night and what I had been choosing not to see for 10 years before it. My name is Thomas Miller. I am 68 years old. I spent 35 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler hauling freight up and down the eastern seaboard, Connecticut to Florida, sometimes out to Ohio, sometimes further. I retired 4 years ago. My wife Carol passed 5 years back. Since then, it has been me in the house in Westchester County, and on weekends, if I was lucky, my daughter Emily. Emily is 35. She teaches 2nd grade at an elementary school 20 minutes from the house she shared with her husband, Ryan Carter. She has her mother's patience and her mother's way of tilting her head when she is trying hard not to cry. She married Ryan when she was 25, and I stood in the back of that church thinking she looked more beautiful than anything I had ever hauled across 3 states. Ryan Carter is 38. He manages a furniture showroom in White Plains, the kind of place with spotlights on the dining sets and salespeople who wear blazers on a Tuesday. He is the sort of man who shakes your hand firmly and looks you in the eye and makes you feel for about 30 seconds like he genuinely cares what you have to say. After 30 seconds, he moves on. I noticed that early. I told myself it was ambition. His parents, Victoria and George Carter, live in a condominium in Scarsdale. Victoria is 66, and she has the posture of a woman who has spent decades deciding she is the most important person in whatever room she enters. George is quieter. He nods where Victoria speaks. He has been nodding for 45 years. The dinner on October 11th was held at their condo to celebrate Ryan's promotion to regional director. Victoria had set the table with the good china. There were candles. There was a standing rib roast that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I wore the blue button-down Emily gave me 2 Christmases ago. I brought a bottle of wine I asked the man at the liquor store to help me pick, because I do not know anything about wine, and I did not want to embarrass my daughter. Emily was quiet when I arrived. She hugged me at the door and held on a second longer than usual. I thought she was just tired. She was in her first trimester, 3 months along, and she had not yet told Ryan's family. She had told me 2 weeks earlier, sitting in my kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug of decaf, her eyes bright, in a way I had not seen in a long time. I promised to keep it between us until she was ready. We sat down to dinner. Victoria opened the conversation by describing in considerable detail Ryan's new responsibilities, his expanded territory, his future with the company. Ryan sat at the head of the table with the careful smile of a man who has been coached on how to receive a compliment. George refilled wine glasses. I ate the rib roast and listened and told myself this was a good night. Then Emily reached across the table for the bread basket, and her elbow caught her water glass. It was not a dramatic spill. The glass-tipped water spread across the white tablecloth, and Emily was already on her feet, saying she was sorry, grabbing her napkin, pressing it to the wet linen. Her face had gone red, the way it always does when she feels she has done something wrong in front of people. Victoria set down her fork. The sound of it against the china plate was very small and very deliberate. She stood up slowly, the way people stand, when they want everyone in the room to watch them do it. She looked at Emily, across the table at my daughter, who was 3 months pregnant and mortified over a glass of water, and she said, clearly loud enough for all 6 people at that table to hear, "This is exactly why my son has been miserable for 10 years. He should never have married you." Emily stopped dabbing at the tablecloth. Her hand went still. I pushed back my chair. I do not have a speech prepared for moments like that. I am not a man who shouts. I spent 35 years in a cab by myself with nothing but road and radio, and I learned a long time ago that most noise is just noise. But I stood up and I opened my mouth, and before a single word came out, George Carter reached across the table, picked up his wine glass, and emptied it into my face. The wine was cold. It hit me across the forehead and ran down into my collar. Someone at the table made a small sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a word. George set the glass down and said in the same flat tone a man uses to discuss the weather, "Stay out of family business. This is between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law." I stood there with wine dripping off my chin. I looked at Emily. She was still standing, napkin in her hand, and she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something past embarrassment, past fear. Something that looked like it had been there a long time and had simply run out of places to hide. I reached for the cloth napkin beside my plate and wiped my face. I walked around the table to my daughter. I put my hand on her arm and said quietly, "Get your coat." She did not argue. She did not look at Ryan. Ryan sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the tablecloth and said nothing. We walked out together. The elevator down to the parking garage took 40 seconds. Emily held her purse against her stomach with both hands, and I watched the floor numbers count down, and neither of us spoke because there was nothing in the English language adequate to what had just happened in that dining room. I drove her to my house in Westchester. She sat in the passenger seat with her head turned toward the window. The highway was quiet that time of night. October darkness, taillights ahead of us, the heater running low. Halfway there, she said, "Dad, I'm sorry you had to see that." I kept my eyes on the road. My hands were steady on the wheel. 35 years of driving will do that for you. Your hands learn to stay steady even when the rest of you is not. "You don't have anything to be sorry for?" I said. She turned back to the window. I pulled into my driveway at 9:47. We sat in the car for a moment after I cut the engine. The porch light was on. It is always on. Carol used to say a dark porch was an unwelcoming porch, and I have never been able to make myself turn the timer off. Emily reached for the door handle. Then she stopped. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, gently, the way you touch something you are afraid of losing. "The baby's okay," she said. Quietly, like she was reminding herself. "I know," I said. We went inside. I put the kettle on. Emily sat at the kitchen table and I stood at the counter with my back to her, and I was thinking about the expression on her face in that elevator, the one that looked like it had been there a long time. The kettle had not yet boiled when my phone buzzed on the counter. I looked at the screen. Ryan Carter. I picked up on the third ring. Not because I wanted to talk to Ryan Carter. I picked up because I have spent 68 years believing that a man who refuses to answer a phone call is a man who is afraid of what he might hear. I am not afraid of what people have to say to me. I have driven through ice storms on the Pennsylvania Turnpike at 2 in the morning. A phone call is just a phone call. Thomas. Ryan's voice was measured, calm in the particular way that people are calm when they have rehearsed being calm. I want to apologize for what happened tonight. My mother, she gets emotional sometimes. She didn't mean what she said. I stood at my kitchen counter with the phone against my ear and looked at the kettle on the stove. Steam was beginning to curl from the spout. She said it clearly enough, I said, a short pause. I understand you're upset. I am too. But I think if we all take a breath and give Mom a day or two to calm down, we can sit down together and work through this like adults. Work through this like adults. I have heard that phrase used by people who want you to forget what happened and call the forgetting maturity. Ryan, I said, your mother put her hands on my daughter. I know, and I'm going to talk to her about that. I promise you, Thomas, I am going to handle this. The kettle began to whistle. I turned off the burner. You were sitting at the head of the table, I said. You watched it happen. Another pause. Longer this time. It all happened so fast. I was in shock. I did not say anything to that because there was nothing useful to say. A man who is in shock for the 3 seconds it takes to stand up and put himself between his wife and his mother is a man who has made a choice. He just does not want to call it that. Get some sleep, Ryan, I said. We'll talk another time. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the counter. Emily was still at the kitchen table. She had her hands wrapped around the mug of chamomile tea I had made her, and she was looking at the surface of the liquid the way people look at things when they are not actually seeing them. Her left eye was slightly swollen where Victoria's palm had connected. It would be worse by morning. What did he say? She asked. That his mother gets emotional sometimes. Emily nodded slowly, like this was a reasonable explanation, like it was information she was filing away in a drawer she had been filling for 10 years. That nod broke something loose in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. Something that had been sitting in the corner of a room waiting for me to finally look at it. Emily, I said. Has she done that before? She looked up from the mug. Her chin moved a small, tight motion that was not quite a shake and not quite a nod. Not like that, she said. Not in front of people. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The kitchen clock above the refrigerator read 10:43. The house was very quiet around us. Tell me what you mean by that, I said. She opened her mouth, then she closed it. Then she said, Dad, it's complicated. I have nowhere to be. She looked down at her tea again. Her thumb moved back and forth across the ceramic handle, and I watched her work through whatever calculation she was running. How much to say, how much to protect, how much she had already spent years protecting. The bruise on her cheek was deepening even as we sat there. She's just very particular, Emily finally said. About the house, about how things are done. Ryan says she means well. Ryan says she means well. My daughter, 35 years old, a woman who manages 22nd graders every single day with patience and skill, was sitting in my kitchen telling me her mother-in-law means well. I wanted to reach across the table and take her hands. I wanted to tell her that what I had seen tonight was not a woman who means well having a bad evening. But I have raised Emily to make her own decisions, and I knew with the certainty of a man who has driven enough miles to understand when a road needs to be traveled slowly, that pushing too hard tonight would only make her close the door. So I said, You don't have to figure everything out tonight. She exhaled. It was the exhale of a woman who has been holding her breath for longer than one evening. Around 11:30, I walked her to the guest room and told her the extra blanket was in the closet on the left. She hugged me at the door, tight both arms, the way she used to hug me when she was small enough that I could lift her off the ground. After she closed the door, I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked to the living room and picked up my phone and called Sandra Kowalski. Sandra has lived next door for 22 years. She was a nurse for 30 of them, and she has the particular quality of people who have spent decades in hospitals. She does not panic, and she does not pretend things are fine when they are not. Her phone rang 4 times before she answered her voice alert despite the hour. "Tom, what happened?" I told her. All of it. The dinner, Victoria, the wine on my face, the drive home, the phone call from Ryan, the way Emily said it's complicated, like that explained anything at all. Sandra listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I value most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tom, don't do anything tonight. Don't call anybody, don't drive anywhere, don't make any decisions. You hear me?" "I hear you. Get some sleep. Look at this fresh in the morning." A pause. "And Tom, look at all of it. Not just tonight." I said goodnight and set the phone down. I stood in the living room in the dark. On the wall above the television, Carol looked back at me from the photograph we took at Niagara Falls in 1989. She is laughing in it. She is always laughing in the ones I keep. I looked at her for a long time. Then I turned off the lamp and went to bed knowing I would not sleep. In the morning, I drove to the house Emily shared with Ryan for the first time in months. I told myself I was checking on her. That was true. But as I turned onto their street and pulled into the driveway and looked up at the house my daughter had lived in for a decade, I realized there was something else I had come to do. I had come to look. Really look. The way Sandra had told me to. I rang the doorbell. Emily answered. Ryan was already at work. She led me into the living room, and I stepped inside, and I stopped. I have been inside a lot of homes over the years. You drive long haul for 3.5 decades, you learn to read a place fast. The ones where people are comfortable, the ones where they are performing comfort, and the ones where something has gone quietly wrong, and nobody is saying so out loud. I stepped into Emily's living room, and I read it in about 10 seconds. The walls were decorated carefully, expensively even. A large canvas print above the sofa, abstract charcoal and cream, the kind of thing a designer picks because it offends nobody. Framed photographs arranged along the console table by the window. A gallery wall beside the hallway leading to the kitchen, 8 or 9 frames all matching all level. I walked to the console table first. Ryan and Victoria at what looked like a resort, both of them in white linen. Ryan and George at a golf course. Ryan holding a club, both of them squinting into the sun. A formal portrait of the Carter family. Ryan, Victoria, George taken somewhere with a neutral background, everyone in navy blue. A photograph of Ryan at what I assumed was a company event, shaking hands with a man in a suit. I moved to the gallery wall. More of the same. Ryan and Emily at their wedding, that one was there. Emily in her dress. Ryan with his hand at the small of her back. But around it, filling the remaining 7 frames, the Carters. Victoria at a birthday dinner. George and Victoria on what looked like a cruise ship deck. A younger Ryan in a graduation gown, Victoria's arm around him, her smile wide and proprietary. Emily came out of the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee. She stopped when she saw where I was standing. "Where are the pictures of your mother?" I asked. She set the mugs down on the coffee table. She was quiet for a moment, pulling the sleeve of her cardigan down over her wrist, the way she used to do as a teenager when she was uncomfortable. I have some in the bedroom, she said. In the nightstand drawer. In the drawer, I said. Ryan thought he said the bedroom was more personal, that the common areas should feel neutral. I looked at the gallery wall again. 8 frames. 7 of them Carter family. One of them Ryan and Emily, and even in that one it was Ryan who was centered. There's no picture of me anywhere in this house, I said. It was not an accusation. It was just something I was saying out loud for the first time because saying it made it real in a way that thinking it did not. Emily's jaw tightened. I had one. On the bookshelf in the office. It was from your retirement party. She picked up her mug and held it with both hands. Victoria said it made the room look cluttered. Ryan moved it to the garage. The garage. My retirement photograph was in their garage. I did not let my face change. I have had a lot of practice at that, keeping my face still while something moves underneath it. I picked up my coffee and sat down on the sofa and asked Emily how she was feeling, how the pregnancy was going, whether she had scheduled her next appointment. She answered each question carefully, and I listened, and in the back of my mind I was running a calculation I had not expected to be running that morning. We talked for 40 minutes. Emily told me she had not slept well. She said Ryan had come home late the previous night, and that they had not really spoken. She said Victoria had sent a text message that morning, not to Emily, to Ryan, and that Ryan had read it and not shown it to her. What did it say? I asked. He said it was just Mom checking in. I nodded. I drank my coffee. Before I left, Emily asked me to get her gray scarf from the bedroom closet. She had hurt her shoulder reaching overhead, and the top shelf was giving her trouble. I went down the hall and opened the closet door. The scarf was on the second shelf. I found it in 3 seconds. I would have been back in the living room in 5, except that my eyes moved to the shelf above it, where a garment bag was hanging from the rod. The zipper had slipped partway open, and through the gap I could see fabric ivory with small pearl buttons along the cuff. I recognized it immediately. It was Carol's wedding dress. The one Emily had asked me for 6 months after our wedding when she was 8 years old and wanted to play dress-up. I had kept it in a box for years. When Emily moved out, she asked if she could take it with her. I said, of course. I stood there for a moment looking at the garment bag. Then, because I am not a man who pries, I started to pull the closet door shut. The garment bag shifted on the rod. The zipper gap widened, and I saw the back of the dress, and on the white satin lining in ink that had dried dark words written in a careful, deliberate hand. I reached in and turned the fabric toward the light. She wasn't worthy either. I stood in my daughter's bedroom closet with Carol's wedding dress in my hands and read those 5 words 3 times. My chest did something I do not have a clean word for. Not anger, anger is loud, anger moves. This was the opposite. This was a stillness so complete it felt like the house had stopped breathing around me. I recognized the handwriting. I had seen it on a birthday card Victoria sent Ryan last Christmas, left open on the kitchen counter when I stopped by to drop off Emily's forgotten phone charger. I folded the dress back carefully, zipped the garment bag closed, took the gray scarf from the second shelf, walked back down the hall, handed the scarf to Emily, finished my coffee, said I had some errands to run and that I would call her later. Drove home, sat in my car in my own driveway for 7 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Then I picked up my phone and called my brother Dale in Tennessee. Dale picked up on the second ring, the way he always does, like he has been sitting beside the phone waiting for whoever needs him next. He is 71 years old, and he lives alone in a single-story house outside Knoxville with 2 bird feeders in the backyard, and more patience than any man I have ever known. Tom, he said. Just my name. But the way Dale says your name, you know he already understands something is wrong. I was sitting at my kitchen table with Carol's wedding dress laid across the surface in front of me. I had brought it home without thinking clearly about whether I should. I just could not leave it there. "I need to tell you something," I said. "Then tell me." So I did. I started with the dinner the night before, Victoria slapped the wine on my face. Ryan sitting at the head of the table doing nothing. Then I told him about the house this morning. The photographs. The retirement picture in the garage. And then I told him about the garment bag in the closet and the 5 words written on the back of his sister-in-law's wedding dress in Victoria Carter's careful hand. Dale did not speak for a long moment after I finished. "She wrote on Carol's dress," he said finally. Not a question. He was making sure he had heard me correctly. "Yes. Tom." His voice had dropped to something low and deliberate. "That woman wrote on Carol's dress." "I know what she did, Dale." "No, I need you to hear me say it out loud, because I don't think you're angry enough yet." He exhaled hard. "That is not a woman who got emotional at a dinner party. That is a woman who went into your daughter's closet and put her hands on the most sacred thing Emily owned and decided to leave her mark on it. That is calculated. That is cruel. And that has been going on in that house for God knows how long." I looked at the dress on my table. Ivory fabric, pearl buttons, the smell of cedar from the garment bag still faintly on it. Carol wore it on a Saturday in June 1981 in a Methodist church in Yonkers with 63 people in the pews. I remember the exact number because I counted them while I was waiting at the altar trying to calm my nerves. "She thinks I'm nobody," I said. "The whole family does, Ryan, Victoria, George. To them, I'm just a retired truck driver who doesn't have anything to say about anything." "Let them think that," Dale said immediately. "Tom, listen to me. You have spent your whole life being underestimated by people who measure a man by what he drives or what he wears or where he eats dinner. And every single time you let them think whatever they wanted and you went ahead and did what needed doing. This is no different. This is Emily. I know it's Emily. That's exactly why you cannot afford to blow up right now." His voice was firm but not unkind. "You blow up, you give Ryan something to point at. You go over there and make noise, Victoria calls it harassment, and Ryan uses it in whatever he's planning. And Tom, whatever Ryan is planning, he has been planning it longer than last night." That landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. "You think he planned it?" I said. "Well, I think a man doesn't sit at the head of his own table and watch his mother hit his pregnant wife without flinching, unless he has already decided which side of what's coming he wants to be on." Dale paused. "How much do you actually know about their finances?" "Not much," I admitted. "Emily never talked about money. Then that's where you start." A long pause. "And Tom, you need to talk to someone who knows the law. Not to sue anybody, not yet. Just to understand what Emily's rights are before Ryan decides to explain them to her himself." I rubbed both hands over my face. Outside my kitchen window, the October light was going flat and gray the way it does in Westchester by 4 in the afternoon. Leaves on the oak tree in the backyard had gone the color of rust. "She's going to protect him," I said. "I can already hear her. She'll tell me it's complicated, that I don't understand, that Ryan means well." "Of course she will," Dale said. "Tom, that woman has been told for 10 years that every problem in that house is her fault. You don't shake that loose with one conversation. You have to show her. Not tell her, show her. Evidence she can hold in her hands and look at with her own eyes." I looked at the wedding dress. "Dale," I said. "She put this in a garment bag and kept it anyway, even after whatever Victoria said to her when she found it. She kept it." Dale was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed something softer underneath the firmness. "Because it's Carol's," he said. "Because Emily is your daughter, and she holds on to things that belong to the people she loves, even when the people around her tell her she shouldn't." He cleared his throat. "She needs you to do the same thing for her right now. Hold on. Don't let go. And do it smart." We talked for another 20 minutes. By the time I set the phone down, the oak tree outside had gone from rust to shadow, and the porch light had clicked on automatically the way Carol programmed it to 30 years ago, and I have never changed. I sat at the table for a while longer. Then I folded Carol's dress, carefully placed it back in the garment bag, and carried it to the spare room closet, my closet in my house where nobody would touch it. I came back to the kitchen and opened my laptop. I typed the name of a family attorney Sandra had mentioned once a year ago in a conversation I had not expected to need to remember. Then I picked up my phone and called Pat Sullivan. Pat Sullivan agreed to meet me the next morning at a coffee shop called Birchwood Roasters on Mamaroneck Avenue, about 4 blocks from the elementary school where she and Emily both taught. She was already there when I arrived, second table from the window, a mug in front of her, her coat still on, like she was not sure yet how long she planned to stay. She is 38 years old, Pat Sullivan. Compact and direct, with the kind of eyes that have seen enough of life not to be surprised by most of it. She taught 4th grade. Emily had mentioned her name over the years, usually in the context of "Pat thinks" or "Pat said," and I had formed the impression of someone Emily trusted in the specific way you trust the one person who tells you the truth when everyone else is being careful. I sat down across from her. A waitress came. I ordered black coffee. Pat wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me steadily. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I have been waiting for someone from Emily's family to call me for about 4 years," she said. "So thank you for finally doing it." That hit me harder than I expected. "Tell me what you know," I said. Pat set her mug down. She did not look away from me when she spoke, and she did not soften what she said, and I respected her for both of those things. Every Saturday morning, she said, Victoria Carter shows up at Emily's house. No call ahead, no text. She just appears. Emily told me she started doing it about 6 months after the wedding and never stopped. Pat's jaw tightened. She walks through the house and she checks things. The baseboards, the grout in the kitchen tiles, the inside of the microwave. She runs her finger along the top of the refrigerator. She paused. And if she finds anything at all, she calls Ryan into the room. Not Emily. Ryan. And she tells him in front of Emily that this is why he cannot relax in his own home. I kept my hands flat on the table. "And Ryan?" I said. "What does Ryan do?" "He nods," Pat said. "Sometimes he says, 'I know, Mom, I'll talk to her.' And then he goes back to whatever he was doing." She picked up her mug again. "Emily told me that about 2 years ago she started waking up on Friday nights with her stomach hurting. She started cleaning the house at 11 o'clock at night, so it would be ready. She set an alarm for 6 on Saturday mornings to do a final check before Victoria arrived." Pat looked at me directly. "Your daughter was setting an alarm on her day off to prepare for an inspection of her own home, Mr. Miller." Something moved through my chest that I did not have a word for. Not anger, I was past the point where anger felt like the right name for it. It was something denser, something with weight and edges. "There's more," Pat said. "Tell me." She set her mug down again carefully, like she was buying herself one more second. "Emily is not allowed to mention her mother in that house." I looked at her. Victoria told Ryan that when Emily talked about Carol, it felt like a comparison. like Emily was implying that her side of the family was better. Pat's voice stayed even, but her knuckles had gone white around the mug handle. Ryan told Emily it made family conversations uncomfortable. He asked her to stop, and Emily, because that is who Emily is, she stopped. Pat leaned forward slightly. For 10 years, your daughter has not been able to say your wife's name in her own home. She cannot say my mother used to make it this way, or my mother loved this kind of music. Nothing. Carol Miller does not exist inside that house. The coffee shop was warm and smelled of espresso and cinnamon, and somewhere behind me 2 women were laughing about something, and the ordinary world was going on around me, completely indifferent to what I had just heard. I thought about the drives Emily and I used to take after Carol passed. Sunday afternoons, no destination, just moving. Emily would talk about her mother the whole time, little things, specific things, the way Carol hummed while she did the dishes, the brand of hand lotion she always kept by the kitchen sink. I thought those drives were Emily's way of keeping Carol close. Now I understood they might have been the only place she was allowed to. She never told me any of this, I said. No. Pat's voice was quiet. She wouldn't. She was ashamed. Not of her mother, never of Carol. She was ashamed that she had let it go on. She looked at me steadily. She kept telling me it wasn't that bad, that Ryan just needed peace at home, that Victoria was from a different generation. Pat exhaled slowly. And I kept telling her that peace you buy by erasing yourself isn't peace. It's just a quieter kind of loss. I sat with that for a moment. Did she ever try to push back? I asked. Once, Pat said. About 3 years ago. She framed a photograph of you and Carol and put it on the kitchen windowsill. Victoria took it down the following Saturday and left it on the counter face down with a sticky note that said, "This is a marital home, not a shrine." Pat watched my face. Ryan told Emily Victoria meant well. I drank the rest of my coffee. It had gone cold. When I stood to leave, Pat stood too. She held out her hand, and I shook it, and she held on for a moment. "Mr. Miller," she said, "whatever you're going to do, please do it before that baby gets here. Because once that child is born into that situation, it gets a whole lot harder to undo." I drove home through Westchester on roads I have known for 40 years, and I thought about Carol's hand lotion by the kitchen sink and my retirement photograph face down on a sticky note, and Emily setting an alarm on Friday nights to clean her own house. That evening, I opened my laptop and sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, the oak tree was dark against a darker sky. I started to look. Really look. The way Sandra had told me to, and Dale had told me to, and now Pat had told me to. And by midnight, I had found the first number that made my hands go still. The number that stopped my hands was not the largest one I would find. I did not know that yet, sitting at my kitchen table at midnight on October 13th with the laptop screen, the only light in the house. What I found that night was a property record, public information available to anyone willing to spend 40 minutes on the Westchester County Clerk's website. The house Emily and Ryan lived in, the 3-bedroom colonial on Birchwood Lane in Harrison, was listed under 2 names: Emily Miller Carter and Ryan Carter. Joint ownership. Purchased 6 years ago for $480,000. Current estimated value $520,000. I stared at that number for a long time. Then I opened a new tab and started looking at mortgage records. I did not sleep that night. By 5 in the morning, I had 3 pages of notes in the yellow legal pad I keep in the kitchen drawer, the one Carol bought at a Staples in 2003, and I have been slowly working through ever since. Most of what I had written were questions, but some of it were numbers, and the numbers did not add up in the way I would have expected them to for a household with 2 incomes and no children. The next morning, I called my financial advisor. His name is Gerald Marsh, and he has been managing the modest portfolio I built over 35 years of driving for a company that offered a pension and a 401k and not much else. I told Gerald I needed to understand exactly where I stood, not because I planned to spend anything, because I needed to know what I had. Gerald ran through it with me over the phone. The pension came to a reliable amount each month. The 401k had grown steadily. But the part Gerald walked me through that morning, the part I had never added up in one sitting before, was the property. 3 parcels of land I had purchased over the years in Westchester and Putnam counties. Small lots, nothing dramatic, bought cheap in the 80s and 90s, when I had extra money and no particular plan for it, other than the instinct that land does not disappear. 2 of them I rented to a landscaping company for storage. 1 I had been meaning to sell for a decade and kept not selling. When Gerald gave me the total assets property savings combined, I wrote it down on the yellow legal pad. $2.4 million. I looked at that number for a while. Then I looked at the coffee maker on the counter, the one Carol bought at a Sears the year before she got sick. The one I have repaired twice because I cannot bring myself to replace it. I thought about the way Victoria Carter had looked at me across that dinner table, the particular quality of her attention, which was the attention of a woman confirming something she had already decided. That I was nobody. That I was a worn-out man with a working-class address who had nothing useful to contribute to her son's life or her family's future. I had never corrected that impression. It had not seemed necessary. Now I understood that my silence had cost my daughter something. Not money, not directly. But when the people around Emily understood Thomas Miller to be a man without resources, without standing, without anything to offer, they understood Emily that way too. She came from nothing in their accounting. She brought nothing to the table. She could be treated accordingly. I called Sandra that afternoon. She came over with a pot of soup she said she had made too much of, which is Sandra's way of taking care of people without making them feel taken care of. We sat at the kitchen table and I told her what I had found on the county website and what Gerald had told me that morning. Sandra listened. Then she said, "Tom, you need a lawyer. Not Gerald. A family attorney." "I know. I mentioned one to you once. Margaret Holloway. She handled a situation for my nephew in White Plains 2 years ago. Property dispute, divorce involved. She was thorough and she was honest, and she did not charge him for questions she could answer in 5 minutes." Sandra pointed at my legal pad. "Call her tomorrow morning." I called Margaret Holloway the next morning. Her office was on Martine Avenue in White Plains, 12 minutes from my house. Her assistant scheduled me for that Friday, October 18th. In the 4 days between that call and that appointment, I kept looking. Property records, public court filings, business registration documents for Carter Home Interiors, the showroom Ryan managed, which I discovered was not merely a showroom he managed, but a limited liability company of which Ryan Carter was listed as a 50% owner. The other 50% was registered to Victoria Carter. I wrote that down too. The morning of October 18th, I put on the same blue button-down I had worn to the dinner. It was the nicest thing I owned that was clean. I drove to White Plains and parked in a garage on Martine Avenue and rode an elevator to the 4th floor and sat in a waiting room with a single plant in the corner that looked like it was trying very hard to stay alive. Margaret Holloway came out to get me herself. She was perhaps 55 with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the direct manner of someone who has heard a great many difficult stories and understands that the most useful thing she can do is listen carefully and tell the truth. We shook hands. We sat down. I laid the yellow legal pad on the desk between us. She looked at it, then at me. "Tell me what's happening," she said. I told her. All of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, reviewing the notes I had made. Then she looked up and asked me a question I was not prepared for. "Mr. Miller," she said, "do you know whose name the mortgage on that house is under?" 4 days after Sandra suggested her name, I sat across from Margaret Holloway at her desk on the 4th floor of her office on Martine Avenue in White Plains. It was the morning of October 18th. She had asked me at the end of my explanation whose name the mortgage was under. "Emily," I said. "The mortgage is under Emily's name." Margaret Holloway wrote that down without any visible reaction, the way attorneys write things down when they are not surprised, but want you to understand they are taking it seriously. "Both names are just hers?" she asked. "Just hers," I said. "As far as I can tell from the public records." She wrote that down too. "And the joint ownership on the deed that was established at the time of purchase?" "Yes, 6 years ago." Margaret set her pen down and folded her hands on the desk. "Mr. Miller, what you are describing, a mortgage held solely in one spouse's name, while the deed lists both parties, is not unusual. But it becomes significant when we look at who has been making the payments and where the money has been coming from." She paused. "You mentioned your daughter is a school teacher. Do you know her approximate annual salary?" "Around 52,000, I said. "Maybe 54 now. She's been teaching for 11 years. "And Ryan Carter's income?" "I don't know exactly. He manages the showroom, co-owns it with his mother through an LLC. I found the registration online." Margaret picked her pen back up. "That is useful. An LLC complicates income disclosure considerably in divorce proceedings. It creates opportunities to obscure how much money is actually flowing to an individual." She looked at me. "Have you spoken to an accountant?" "Not yet." "I want you to call one," she said. "An independent forensic accountant, not someone connected to your family or to the Carters. Someone who can look at whatever financial documents Emily is willing to provide and tell us what the actual picture looks like." She slid a business card across the desk. "This is a man named Robert Delaney. He works out of Tarrytown. I have used him on 3 cases in the past 2 years. He is precise, and he does not make assumptions." I took the card. "Now," Margaret said, leaning back slightly, "tell me what you know about their debt." I told her what I had pieced together from the public records, the mortgage payments, the property taxes, the LLC filings. I told her about the credit card statements Emily had mentioned once offhandedly in a phone call 2 years ago, something about a balance that was higher than she expected that Ryan said he was handling. I had not thought much of it at the time. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Mr. Miller, I want to explain something to you about what financial abuse looks like in a marriage, because I think it will help you understand what we may be dealing with here." She spoke carefully and plainly, the way good attorneys speak, when they want you to actually hear what they are saying, rather than react to it. She explained that financial abuse, the legal term in New York family law contexts, was economic control, typically involved one spouse maintaining exclusive control over household finances, while the other spouse was kept uninformed or deliberately misled. It did not require physical violence. It did not require a dramatic single event. It was usually built slowly over years through small decisions that individually seemed reasonable and collectively amounted to a cage. "The pattern you are describing," she said, "in which your daughter receives a fixed household allowance, does not have access to joint account statements, and is unaware of the full scope of marital debt. That pattern is consistent with economic control." She held my gaze. "If that is what has been happening, it means Emily may not know how much money she actually earns in this marriage. She may not know how much debt is attached to her name. She may not know what she is entitled to keep." I sat with that for a moment. "What is she entitled to keep?" I asked. New York is an equitable distribution state, Margaret said. That means marital assets and debts are divided fairly, not necessarily equally, but fairly based on each spouse's contribution. If Emily has been the primary income earner, while Ryan's actual earnings were obscured through the LLC, that matters significantly in how a court would divide assets. She paused. The house matters, the debt matters, and if Ryan has been spending marital funds on a personal relationship outside the marriage which you have suggested may be the case, that matters too. Dissipation of marital assets is taken seriously by New York courts. I asked her what the next step was. Get me the financial documents, she said. Whatever Emily can provide, tax returns, bank statements, credit card records, and call Robert Delaney. She looked at the legal pad between us. You have done good preliminary work, Mr. Miller. But I need numbers, not estimates. I drove home from White Plains with the business card in my shirt pocket and Robert Delaney's name written at the top of a fresh page in my legal pad. I called him from my kitchen that afternoon. He had an opening the following week. That evening, Emily called me. Her voice was tight in the particular way it gets when she is trying to sound normal and not quite managing it. Ryan told me we need to talk, she said. About the baby, about the future. A pause. He wants to sit down this weekend. Just the two of us. I gripped the phone. How do you feel about that? I asked carefully. I don't know, she said. He's been different. Since the dinner. Quieter. I can't tell if he's angry or sad or... She stopped. Dad, do you think I should go? I looked at the business card on the counter. Emily, I said. Before you sit down with Ryan this weekend, I need you to do something for me. I need you to find your last 3 tax returns and your most recent bank statements and bring them to my house. A long silence. Why? She asked. Because I love you, I said. And because I think there are things in those documents you need to see before you have that conversation with Ryan. She did not answer right away. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, steady and slow, the way she breathes when she is trying to think clearly. Okay, she finally said. I'll come Saturday morning. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I pulled up Robert Delaney's website and read through his credentials twice. Then I opened a new document and started writing down every financial detail I could remember from every conversation I had ever had with Emily about money. It was a longer list than I expected. At the bottom of the page, I wrote one final note to myself, $73,000. Where did it go? Robert Delaney called me on a Thursday morning 4 days after I first reached out to him. He had reviewed the documents Emily brought to my house that Saturday, 3 years of tax returns, 2 years of bank statements, and a folder of credit card records she had found in the filing cabinet. In the home office, a cabinet Ryan kept locked and had apparently forgotten to relock after retrieving something the previous month. Mr. Miller, Robert said, I want to walk you through what I'm seeing because some of it is going to be difficult to hear. Go ahead, I said. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my legal pad open to a fresh page. Outside, the October sky had gone the flat white of approaching rain. Katinmama, your daughter's gross income over the past 3 years averages approximately $53,000 annually, Robert said. After taxes, she takes home roughly $38,000. In that same period, the household's documented expenses, mortgage, utilities, insurance, groceries, the standard costs of maintaining that property run to approximately $61,000 per year. He paused. That gap of $23,000 per year has to come from somewhere. Over 3 years, that is $69,000 your daughter has been covering through a combination of her savings account draws and 3 personal loans taken out in her name alone. I wrote the number down. $69,000. The mortgage, I said. Is current, Robert said. Emily has never missed a payment, but she has been the one making them. Ryan's documented personal income deposits into the joint account average approximately $11,000 over the same 3-year period. That is $11,000 total, Mr. Miller. Not per year. I set my pen down. What about the LLC? I asked. Carter Home Interiors is where it gets interesting, Robert said, and something in his voice told me interesting was doing considerable work in that sentence. The LLC shows healthy revenue, but Ryan's distributions, the money he actually takes out of the company for personal use, are structured in a way that keeps his visible income artificially low. It is a common technique, legal but deliberately obscuring. A pause. What is not obscured because it ran through a personal account rather than the business is a series of transfers totaling $73,400 over 22 months. Regular amounts. Restaurants, hotels, retail purchases, nothing that looks like a business expense. I picked my pen back up. I need a private investigator, I said. That would be my recommendation, Robert said. I had the name of one already. Sandra's nephew had used a firm out of Yonkers 2 years ago for a workers' compensation matter. I called them that afternoon. A man named Frank Calder took the case. He was 50-something, unhurried, with the flat affect of someone who has spent years looking at things people would prefer, stayed hidden, and learned not to be surprised by any of it. Frank delivered his first report 8 days later. I read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. Jessica Harmond, 29 years old. Her father, Douglas Harmond, was the majority owner of Harmond Commercial Properties, a mid-sized real estate development firm with active projects in Westchester and Fairfield counties. Ryan had been introduced to Douglas Harmond 18 months ago through a furniture contract for one of Harmond's commercial developments. The professional relationship had expanded. So had the personal one. Frank's report included photographs taken in public locations, a restaurant in Greenwich, a hotel lobby in Stamford, a parking garage in White Plains, where Ryan and Jessica had stood talking for 22 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon when Ryan was supposed to be at a vendor meeting. The photographs were clear and unambiguous. I looked at them for a long time. Then I put them face down on the table. I already knew what I needed to know about Jessica Harmond. What I needed to understand was Victoria's role in all of it. Frank's report noted that Victoria Carter had attended 2 dinners with Douglas Harmond in the past year, both at restaurants in Scarsdale, both occasions documented through public social media posts from other attendees. Business dinners on the surface. But the timing aligned precisely with the acceleration of Ryan's relationship with Jessica. Victoria had not stumbled onto this situation. She had cultivated it. I sat with that for a while. Then I picked up my phone and called Marcus Webb. Marcus had been Ryan's closest friend since their undergraduate years at Fordham. He worked in commercial real estate, which meant he likely knew Douglas Harmond or knew people who did. I had met Marcus twice at family gatherings. He was the kind of man who laughs easily and means none of it. He answered on the 4th ring. Mr. Miller. Cautious. He knew who I was. Marcus, I said. I'm going to ask you one question, and I'd like an honest answer. When did Ryan's relationship with Jessica Harmond begin? A long silence. Mr. Miller, I'm not sure I should. My daughter is 3 months pregnant, I said. And Ryan has been spending $73,000 on another woman. I am not calling to argue with you. I am calling because I think you already know this is wrong, and you have been waiting for someone to give you a reason to say so. Another silence. longer. Before last Christmas, Marcus said finally. His voice had changed, the easiness gone out of it completely. Maybe 14 months ago, around when the Harmon contract started. Did Victoria know from the beginning? Marcus exhaled. The sound of a man setting something down he has been carrying too long. She introduced them, he said. At a dinner at her place in Scarsdale. I was there. A pause. I should have called Emily, I know that. Yes, I said. You should have. I ended the call and looked at Frank Calder's report still sitting face down on the table. Outside, the rain had finally arrived, tapping steadily against the kitchen window. I opened my legal pad to a fresh page and wrote one name at the top, George Carter. George Carter answered on the first ring. That told me something. A man who answers on the first ring at 7:30 in the evening either has nothing to hide or has been expecting the call. George Carter had plenty to hide, which meant he had been expecting it. Thomas, he said. Not Mr. Miller. Thomas. Like we were old friends having a conversation we had both been putting off. George, I said. I'd like to meet with you, just the two of us. A pause. Short, but deliberate. When? Tomorrow morning. There's a diner on Central Avenue in Hartsdale called the Cornerstone. 7 o'clock. Another pause. Longer. I could hear him breathing on the other end, and I thought about the man who had sat at the head of his dining table on October 11th and watched his wife put her hands on my daughter and had not moved a single muscle to stop it. The same man who had then picked up his wine glass and emptied it into my face with the calm efficiency of someone performing a routine task. All right, George said. 7 o'clock. I was there at 6:50. I took a booth near the back, away from the window, and ordered black coffee and told the waitress I was waiting for someone. The Cornerstone was the kind of diner that has been in the same location for 30 years and intends to be there for 30 more red vinyl booths, laminated menus, a pie case by the register with 3 kinds of pie rotating on a slow turntable. I had eaten there maybe a dozen times over the years. It felt like the right place for a conversation that needed to stay on the ground. George walked in at 7:03. He was wearing a gray wool coat and looked like he had not slept particularly well. He spotted me, came to the booth, and sat down without taking his coat off. The waitress appeared. He ordered coffee. She left. We looked at each other across the table. George Carter is 68 years old, same as me. He spent his career in commercial insurance, retired 6 years ago. He is a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that probably inspired confidence in clients. Steady, composed, not given to visible emotion. Sitting across from me in that diner booth, he looked like a man whose composure had recently developed a crack he could not find a way to repair. I know why you called, he said. Then we can skip the part where I explain it, I said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked down at it. How much do you know? Enough, I said. I know about Jessica. I know about the LLC and what Ryan's been doing with the money. I know Victoria introduced them. I paused. And I know you knew. George did not deny it. He lifted his mug, drank, set it down. A man buying himself seconds. For how long? I asked. He looked up at me. About a year. Maybe a little more. And Emily. Emily doesn't know anything, he said. Ryan made sure of that. I kept my hands flat on the table. 35 years behind the wheel taught me that the moments when you most want to accelerate are usually the moments that require the most stillness. George, I said quietly, my daughter is pregnant. She has been carrying this family financially for years without knowing it. Her mother-in-law assaulted her in front of 6 people. And you knew what your son was doing, and you said nothing. George's jaw tightened. He did not look away from me, and I respected that much. He did not have the cowardice of a man who cannot face what he has done. I told myself it would work itself out, he said. That Ryan would end it. That Victoria would... He stopped, exhaled through his nose. I told myself a lot of things. What did you actually think would happen? I asked. I thought... He stopped again. His hands tightened around the mug. Victoria had a plan. She always has a plan. I thought if I stayed out of it, the situation would resolve without everyone getting hurt. Everyone got hurt anyway, I said. Just not the people Victoria planned for. He had nothing to say to that. The diner moved around us, a short-order cook calling out an order, the door opening and letting in a blade of cold October air, the pie turntable making its slow rotation. I reached into my coat pocket and placed a plain white envelope on the table between us. Inside was a 4-page summary, Robert Delaney's findings condensed. The mortgage in Emily's name, the LLC distributions, the $73,000. Frank Calder's documented timeline of Ryan and Jessica's relationship. I am not asking you to do anything with that, I said. You don't owe me anything, George. But you owe your son's wife the truth. And before this goes any further, I think you needed to see it written down. George looked at the envelope. He did not pick it up. He stared at it for a long moment, the way a person stares at something they have known was coming, and still are not ready to receive. Victoria wants me to stay out of it, he said. I know she does. She says you're trying to destroy the family. I'm trying to protect my daughter, I said. George, those are not the same thing, and somewhere underneath everything Victoria has told you for 45 years, I think you know that. He picked up the envelope. He did not open it at the table. He put it in his coat pocket and sat with it there for a moment, his hand resting flat on the outside of the pocket, like he was checking that it was real. I'll read it, he said. That's all I'm asking. I paid for both coffees. We walked out separately. The morning was cold and gray, the trees along Central Avenue stripped nearly bare. Driving home, I thought about two things. The first was the look on George's face when he put the envelope in his pocket. Not guilt exactly. Something older than guilt. Something that had been accumulating for a very long time. The second thing I thought about was Emily. 3 days later, she called me at 9 in the evening. Her voice was shaking in a way I had not heard since she was a child, and had fallen off her bicycle on the driveway, and was trying very hard not to cry. Dad, she said, Ryan told me something tonight. He said you have been trying to destroy our marriage since the beginning. He said you called his friends. He said you hired people to spy on him. A breath. He said you're the reason our family is falling apart. I did not answer Emily's accusation right away. Not because I did not know what to say, but because I needed to say it correctly, and saying something correctly when it matters most requires a moment that most people mistake for hesitation. Emily, I said, I need you to come over. Tonight. Dad, it's almost 9:30. I know what time it is. Come over. She arrived 40 minutes later. She was still in her work clothes, a navy cardigan, dark slacks, and her hair was pulled back the way she wears it when she has had a long day and stopped caring about the details. Her eyes were red at the corners. She had been crying in the car. I could tell by the way she held her face very still when she walked, in the deliberate stillness of someone who has recently finished crying and does not want to start again. I had made chamomile tea. I set a mug in front of her and sat down across the table. Tell me exactly what Ryan said, I said. She wrapped both hands around the mug. He said you called his friends without telling me. He said you hired someone to follow him. He said you've never thought he was good enough for me, and you've been looking for a reason to end our marriage since the beginning." Her voice was tight and careful. "He said if I don't ask you to stop, he's going to have to take legal steps to protect his privacy." I listened to all of it without interrupting. Then I said, "Emily, do you remember about 2 years ago when I came to your house and we sat at your kitchen table, and I told you that you needed to work harder at your marriage?" She looked up from her mug, her brow pulled together. "Yes." "Do you remember what I said specifically?" She was quiet for a moment. "You said Ryan told you I'd been distant, that I wasn't showing up for him the way a wife should." Her voice changed on the last part, got smaller. "You said Mom would have wanted me to fight for my marriage." I felt that land in my chest exactly the way I knew it would. "Ryan came to see me," I said. "About 2 years ago. Without you. He told me you were struggling emotionally, that you were pulling away from him, that he was worried about you but didn't know how to reach you." I kept my voice steady. "He asked me to talk to you, to encourage you to invest more in the marriage. He said it would mean more coming from me than from him." Emily's hands went very still around the mug. I believed him," I said. "I should have called you first. I should have asked you directly what was happening instead of taking his word for it. I didn't, and I said things to you that hurt you, and I have carried that since the moment I understood what he had done with it." I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table. "Emily, I am sorry." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something 10 years of small accumulated moments, choices made in the dark, words said in good faith, that landed like stones. Emily's chin trembled once. Then it stopped. She pressed her lips together and looked at the surface of her tea. "He told you I wasn't showing up," she said slowly. "And you came and told me to try harder." She was working through it the way she works through things, methodically giving each piece its proper weight. "And then, when I tried to tell you things weren't right, you thought I was being difficult." "Yes," I said, because she deserved a straight answer more than she deserved a defense. Her breath came out in a long, unsteady stream. "How long have you known what he did?" "Since November 1st, I said. 2 days ago. When I put together the timeline of what he told me against what Pat told me against what the financial records show." I kept my eyes on her. "He used me, Emily. He used me to make you feel like even your own father thought you weren't trying hard enough. And I let him do it, because I trusted him more than I understood him." Emily set the mug down. She pressed both palms flat on the table and stared at them. Her wedding ring caught the kitchen light and threw a small, bright point against the wall. "I cried for 3 days after that conversation," she said. "I thought you were disappointed in me." Those words hit me harder than anything George Carter had done with a wine glass. "I was never disappointed in you," I said. "Not once. Not for a single day." She looked up at me. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. The jaw of a woman who has been bending for 10 years and has just felt something inside her stop bending. "What else?" she said. "What do you mean?" "You said you put together a timeline." Her voice was quiet but direct. "What else did you find?" I looked at my daughter, 35 years old, a child of mine, sitting in my kitchen at 10:15 at night, with her hands flat on the table and her eyes clear despite everything, and I made a decision. I stood up, walked to the counter, picked up the folder I had set there before she arrived, came back to the table and placed it in front of her. "All of it," I said. Everything I know. Emily looked at the folder. She did not open it immediately. She put one hand on top of it flat, the way her mother used to touch things she was not yet ready to fully receive. Then she opened it. Emily read the way she does everything carefully, completely, without rushing. She turned each page the way you turn pages when you understand that what is written on them cannot be unread, and you want to be certain you are reading it right before you let yourself react. I sat across from her and did not speak. The kitchen clock above the refrigerator marked the minutes. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window, and then it was dark and quiet again. She was on the third page when her breathing changed. Not dramatically, just a slight deepening, a controlled steadiness that told me she was working to keep herself level. I recognized it. Carol used to breathe that way when she was processing something that required her full strength to hold. The third page was Robert Delaney's summary of the financial records. The mortgage in Emily's name. The 3 personal loans. $69,000 over 3 years drawn from her savings to cover a household. Ryan had allowed her to believe they were managing together. Emily set that page down and picked up the next one without comment. The fourth page was Frank Calder's timeline. Jessica Harmond. 14 months. The restaurant in Greenwich, the hotel in Stamford, the parking garage in White Plains. Documented dates, documented locations. Frank was thorough, he did not editorialize. He simply recorded what he had observed, and what he had observed was sufficient. Emily read it to the bottom of the page. Then she placed it face down on the stack of pages she had already finished, and she pressed her palm flat on top of it, and she kept her hand there. "How long have you known about her?" she asked. 10 days, I said. She nodded slowly like she was filing that away. "Did Ryan know that you knew?" "Not until recently," I said. "He knows now that I've been looking. He doesn't know how much I've found." She turned to the 5th page. This one I had been dreading since I put the folder together. It was a printout. Frank had retrieved it through a mutual contact of Marcus Webb, a text thread Ryan had sent to 2 friends during the 18 months Emily had been undergoing treatment for a thyroid condition 4 years ago. The messages were exactly what they were. No interpretation required. Emily read the first message. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She read the second, the third. Her hand resting on the table beside the folder curled slowly inward, not a fist, not quite just fingers drawing toward the palm the way they do when something cold moves through you. She finished the page, set it down, did not place her hand on top of it this time. "He said I wasn't the woman he married anymore," she said. Her voice was entirely level. That levelness was more difficult to witness than tears would have been. "Yes," I said. "While I was sick." "Yes." She looked at the wall to her left at the space above the kitchen doorway where I have a framed photograph of the Catskills that Carol bought at a craft fair in Woodstock the summer before Emily was born. She looked at it for a long moment, not really seeing it the way people look at neutral things when they are trying to keep the floor under them. "I asked him to come with me to 2 of my appointments," she said quietly. "He said he had work commitments. I went by myself both times." She paused. "I thought he was just busy." I did not say anything. There was nothing to add to that. She turned to the last page. This one was shorter, a summary I had written myself in plain language of what Victoria's role had been. The Saturday inspections, the LLC structure, the Scarsdale dinner where Victoria had introduced Ryan to Jessica Harmond and Douglas Harmond, with the specific intention of building a relationship that would serve Ryan's career after Emily was removed from the picture. Emily read it through once. Then she read it again. Then she closed the folder. She sat with her hands in her lap, and her eyes on the closed cover of the folder. And I watched my daughter do something I have only seen her do twice in her life, once when Carol was diagnosed, and once when Carol passed. She gathered herself, visibly, deliberately, the way you gather something that has been scattered by a hard wind, picking up each piece and placing it back where it belongs. "Dad," she said, "did Ryan know I was pregnant before the dinner?" "Yes," I said. "He knew." Her eyes closed briefly, opened again. "And he still—" "Yes." She pressed both hands flat on the table again. Her wedding ring was still on her finger. She looked down at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at me and her eyes were dry and very clear. And she said something I had been waiting 10 years to hear her say. "I don't want to go back there." 3 words that cost her everything she had spent a decade building and protecting and making excuses for. 3 words that told me my daughter had finally found the floor beneath the floor she had been standing on, and it was solid, and she was standing on it. "You don't have to," I said. She stood up from the table, walked to the kitchen window, and stood looking out at the backyard. My backyard, the oak tree, the porch light Carol had programmed 30 years ago, still doing its job. She pressed one hand against the glass, palm, flat fingers spread. "He's going to fight me," she said. "I know. He's going to say terrible things." "He already has," I said. It didn't change anything. She turned from the window. Her hand dropped to her side. She looked at me across the kitchen, her father, 68 years old, sitting at the table where she had eaten breakfast as a child. And something moved across her face that I recognized as the particular courage of a person deciding to stop being afraid. "What do I do first?" she asked. "First," I said, "you call Margaret Holloway in the morning." Emily nodded once. Firm. Decided. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text message. She glanced at it. Her expression did not change, but her chin lifted slightly. "Victoria," she said. "She wants to know why I haven't been returning her calls. Nobody invited me to Thanksgiving dinner at the Carter house. I want to be clear about that, because what I am about to describe could easily be misread as the action of a man who showed up looking for a fight. I was not looking for a fight. I was looking for a table with enough people around it that the truth could not be quietly folded up and put away in a drawer the way it had been for 10 years. I rang the doorbell at 6:15 on the Friday evening after Thanksgiving. Emily had told me the family gathering had been moved to the Friday this year because Ryan had commitments on Thursday. I did not ask what the commitments were. I already had a reasonable idea. George answered the door. He had called me that morning at 7:45. He said only 4 words, "Come tonight if you can." I did not ask him to explain. I understood what it cost a man like George Carter to make that call, and I was not going to make it cost more by asking him to justify it. He looked at me for a moment, one long, measuring look, and then he stepped aside and let me in. That told me everything I needed to know about where George Carter's head was after 3 weeks of sitting with the envelope I had given him at the Cornerstone Diner. The condo smelled of reheated food and candle wax. The dining table was set for 6. Victoria was in the kitchen. I could hear her voice from the entryway, clipped instructional, the voice she uses when she is directing the movement of objects and people with equal authority. Ryan was standing by the window in the living room with a glass of wine, and when he turned and saw me, the glass stopped halfway to his mouth. "What is he doing here?" Ryan said. "Tiku. He's here because I asked him," George said from behind me. Victoria came out of the kitchen. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse, and the particular expression she reserves for situations that have deviated from her plan controlled fury, wrapped in social composure the way you wrap something sharp, so it does not cut you while you are carrying it. Thomas, she said, my name like a verdict. This is a family dinner. I know, I said. Emily is my family. Emily was sitting at the dining table, already her hands in her lap, her face carefully neutral. She had known I was coming. We had spoken that afternoon. She had said simply, "Okay, Dad." 2 words that contained more courage than most speeches. Victoria looked at George. The look she gave him was the look of a woman who has spent 45 years communicating entire paragraphs through a single expression, and what this particular expression said was, "Fix this right now." George did not fix it. He walked to the dining table and pulled out the chair at the end, his chair, the one he had sat in at every family dinner for as long as this table had existed, and sat down. He placed both hands flat on the tablecloth and looked at his son. "Ryan," he said, "sit down." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Dad, this is not—" "Sit down," George said again, quietly. The quietness of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in negotiating around it. Ryan sat. Victoria remained standing for a moment longer than was comfortable, then pulled out her chair with a precision that communicated exactly how she felt about being managed in her own home, and sat. I took the remaining chair beside Emily. She did not look at me. She looked straight ahead. Under the table, she pressed her knee briefly against mine, one small, deliberate contact that said, "I see you and I am still here," and then she moved it away. Victoria opened the conversation the way she always opens difficult conversations, by pretending there is no difficulty. She asked Ryan about a project at work. Ryan answered in monosyllables, his eyes moving between me and his father, with the calculation of a man trying to determine which threat requires more immediate management. George let her talk for approximately 4 minutes. Then he set his fork down. The sound of it was very small and very final. "I need to say something," George said. Victoria's expression shifted. "George, we have a guest." "Thomas is not a guest," George said. "Thomas is Emily's father, and he has been treated in this house and in our family in ways that I am ashamed of." He looked at Victoria directly. "Ways that I permitted." The room went completely still. Ryan leaned forward. "Dad, whatever he told you—" "Ryan," George's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I have read what Thomas gave me. I have had 3 weeks to sit with it. And I am going to say what I should have said a long time ago. And I need you to let me finish before you respond." Ryan closed his mouth. George looked at Emily. His eyes held something I had not seen in them before. Not guilt, which is a feeling you have about yourself, but grief, which is a feeling you have about what you have done to someone else. "So Emily," he said, "your husband has not been honest with you. He has been conducting a relationship outside this marriage for over a year with the knowledge and encouragement of your mother-in-law." He paused. "The financial situation in your household is not what you have been told it is. You have been carrying obligations that were represented to you as shared. They were not shared." Victoria's voice came out sharp and fast. "George, stop. I watched my wife strike you at your own dinner table," George said, still looking at Emily. And I said nothing. I have no excuse for that. I am telling you now that it was wrong and that I knew it was wrong when it happened, and that my silence made me responsible for what followed. Victoria stood up. Her chair scraped back hard against the floor. "This is outrageous. You are airing our family's—" "Our family's what?" George said. He looked up at his wife, and in his face was something I recognized, the look of a man who has spent decades carrying a weight he told himself was normal and has finally set it down and is astonished by how much lighter the air is. "Our family's private business, Victoria. Our private business has been living in this girl's house for 10 years. Ryan pushed back from the table. His face had gone through several colors in rapid succession and had arrived at something pale and rigid. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said. His voice was aimed at me. "You came into this family, and you turned everyone against me. You are the reason my marriage is falling apart." I looked at my son-in-law across the Thanksgiving table. "Ryan," I said, "your marriage is falling apart because of the choices you made." I just wrote them down. I drove home from the Carter condo that Friday night, with the heater running and the radio off, and the particular quiet of a man who has said what needed saying and is now waiting to find out what it costs. Sandra was sitting on my porch steps when I pulled into the driveway. She had her coat buttoned to the collar and a thermos of coffee in her hands, and she looked like a woman who had decided she was going to wait however long it took. "Well," she said. "George said everything," I said. "Ryan said nothing useful." Victoria stood up and knocked her chair back and made a speech about family loyalty that nobody listened to. Sandra poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to me. And Emily. Emily sat through all of it without flinching. I drank the coffee. It was very hot and very strong, which was exactly right. She's stronger than she knows she is. "She gets that from somewhere," Sandra said. I did not answer that. But I sat down on the steps beside her, and we finished the coffee between us while the November dark settled over the neighborhood, and the oak tree in my backyard made its slow sounds in the wind. The week that followed was the loudest week of the entire situation, which was strange because most of the noise happened on a telephone screen rather than in any room I was standing in. Ryan called me 11 times between Saturday morning and the following Wednesday. I answered twice. The first time he was composed, measured, careful, the rehearsed calm I had heard on the night of October 11th. He said George had been manipulated. He said the documents I had shown around were taken out of context. He said he was prepared to discuss everything rationally if I would agree to stop involving outside parties. I told him the outside parties were involved because the inside parties had not been honest. He called again that evening. This time the composure was gone. He said I had ruined his career. He said I had poisoned his father against his own family. He said things about me that I will not repeat, not because they hurt me, but because repeating them gives them more weight than they deserve. I listened until he ran out of breath. Then I said, "Ryan, everything I have shown anyone is true. When you are ready to talk about what is true, call me back." I ended the call and blocked his number. 3 days after Thanksgiving, Emily called me at 7 in the morning. Her voice was steady but tight. "He came to the school," she said. I sat up straighter in my kitchen chair. "What happened?" "He waited in the parking lot during my lunch break. He said he wanted to talk without lawyers and fathers involved. He said if I would just come home, we could start over. That he would end things with Jessica. That the baby changed everything." She paused. "He was crying, Dad. Real tears. I could see them." "What did you say?" "I said I had a class starting in 8 minutes, and I went back inside." Another pause. "Was that right?" "That was exactly right," I said. She exhaled. "He looked so, I don't know, small, standing there in the parking lot." "Emily," I said carefully. "Ryan crying in a parking lot is not evidence that he has changed. It is evidence that he has lost something he valued and wants it back. Those are not the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I know that. I just needed to hear someone else say it." That afternoon, George called me. He sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Victoria wants me to recant," he said. She says if I don't tell Ryan and Emily that I was confused, that I misunderstood the situation, she is going to... He stopped. She has made certain threats regarding our living arrangements. George, I said, what do you want to do? A long pause. I want to do what I should have done a long time ago, he said. I'm not recanting anything. Then don't, I said. And George, you might want to talk to someone. A counselor, someone outside the family. Another pause, shorter. Victoria would never, not Victoria, I said. You, for yourself. He was quiet for a long time after that. On the 1st of December, Emily moved the last of her personal documents, tax returns, insurance files, her mother's jewelry box from the house on Birchwood Lane to my spare room. She did it on a Tuesday afternoon while Ryan was at the showroom. She took 3 boxes and a suitcase and the photograph of Carol that Ryan had put face down on a sticky note, and she left everything else exactly where it was. She called me when she was done. It's weird, she said. I kept expecting to feel sad. I mostly just feel tired. Tired is okay, I said. Tired means you've been carrying something heavy. It doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. 4 days later, my phone rang at 8 in the morning. A number I did not recognize. I answered anyway. It was Marcus Webb. He sounded like a man who had not slept well in several weeks. Mr. Miller, he said. Ryan's been calling me every day. He wants me to tell you that he's going to go public with... Marcus stopped, started again. He's planning to stand up at the Harmon Partnership dinner on Friday and tell everyone that you orchestrated this whole situation to destroy his career. He thinks if he gets ahead of it publicly, the narrative changes. I looked at the calendar on my kitchen wall. Friday was December 6th. Marcus, I said, are you going to that dinner? A pause. I was invited. I hadn't decided. I think you should go, I said, a longer pause. Mr. Miller, what are you planning? I looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree, bare now, its branches clean and stark against the December sky. I'm planning to be there, I said, and I'm planning to tell the truth. Before I reveal what happened when I opened that laptop in front of everyone, comment "Stand by" below so I know you're still here with me. And please note, the upcoming chapter contains fictionalized elements crafted for storytelling if you prefer not to continue. Feel free to stop the video right here. I own one suit. I bought it 12 years ago for Carol's funeral and have worn it 4 times since 2 weddings, 1 retirement dinner for a man I drove with for 20 years, and 1 evening I would rather not think about. I put it on that Friday morning and stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at a 68-year-old man in a dark suit and decided that would have to be sufficient. The Harmon Partnership dinner was held at a venue called the Waterford Club on Fenimore Road in Mamaroneck, a converted estate house with valet parking and a private dining room that fit 40 people comfortably. I had looked it up the night before. I drove there myself, parked on the street rather than using the valet, and walked in at 7:20. The event had started at 7. The room was warm and loud with the particular energy of people who are comfortable spending money in the same place at the same time. Round tables with white linens, centerpieces with small winter arrangements, a bar along the far wall doing steady business. Marcus Webb was standing near the entrance. He saw me immediately and crossed the room with the purposeful stride of a man who has made a decision and is moving before he can unmake it. He's already seen you, Marcus said quietly. He's at the center table with Douglas Harmon. His face went white when you walked in. Good, I said. Where can I set up? Marcus pointed to a small side table near the room's secondary entrance, out of the direct sightline of the main table but visible to the room. I carried my laptop bag to it and set the computer on the table and opened it. My hands were steady. 35 years of driving in conditions that required steadiness had given me that much. I did not have to wait long. Ryan crossed the room in 4 minutes. He was wearing a charcoal suit and the smile he uses for professional occasions. Wide, confident, the smile of a man who has decided that offense is the better posture. He stopped on the other side of the table and looked at the laptop and then at me. "You need to leave," he said. "Right now, before this gets worse for everyone." "Ryan," I said. "Sit down." "And I am not sitting down. You are going to pick up that computer and walk out of this room, or I am going to have you removed." I looked at him. "You told Douglas Harmon's daughter that you were a successful independent businessman. You told her you owned half of Carter Home Interiors, free and clear. You told her you had built something from nothing." I paused. "Would you like to sit down now, or would you like Douglas Harmon to hear this from across the room?" Ryan's smile did not disappear so much as calcify, freeze in place, while everything underneath it shifted. He sat down. I turned the laptop toward him first. Robert Delaney's financial summary, the mortgage, the 3 personal loans in Emily's name totaling $69,000. The LLC distribution structure that had kept Ryan's visible income at $11,000 over 3 years, while Emily's salary covered the household. The $73,400 in personal expenditures, restaurants, hotels, retail running through Ryan's private account across 22 months. "These are fabricated," Ryan said. His voice was tight but still controlled. "You paid someone to—" "They're certified by a licensed forensic accountant," I said. "His contact information is on the last page if Douglas Harmon would like to verify independently." Ryan looked at the room. He was calculating exits, allies, angles. The particular calculation of a man who has spent his life managing narratives and is realizing this one has moved beyond his management. He stood up. His voice came out louder than he intended. "This man has been trying to destroy my marriage and my career since the beginning. He hired investigators. He manipulated my father. Everything you are looking at is the result of a campaign this man ran against his own son-in-law because he could not accept that his daughter chose a life that did not include him at the center of it." The room had gone quiet. 40 people with glasses halfway to their mouths. Marcus Webb stood up from his table. He was 12 feet away. He did not raise his voice. He said simply and clearly, "Ryan, I was there when your mother introduced you to Jessica Harmon at that dinner in Scarsdale. I was there 14 months ago. I have been carrying that for a long time, and I am done carrying it." The room absorbed that in silence. Douglas Harmon set his glass down very carefully on the white linen tablecloth. Ryan's mouth opened, closed. His face had moved through white and arrived at something gray. I reached into the laptop bag and placed 3 printed pages on the table. Frank Calder's documented timeline. Photographs taken in public locations, Greenwich, Stamford, White Plains. Jessica Harmon's name on each page, Ryan Carter's name beside it, dates running back 14 months. Douglas Harmon stood up from the center table. He did not say anything to Ryan. He looked at his business manager, nodded once, and walked toward the exit with the deliberate pace of a man who has seen enough to make a decision and has already made it. Ryan watched his father-in-law's business partner walk out of the room. He watched 2 other men from the center table exchange a quiet word and follow. He looked at Marcus, who was still standing, not looking away. He looked at me. I closed the laptop, stood up, picked up the bag. I looked at Ryan Carter one final time across that white linen table in the Waterford Club in Mamaroneck. and I said the only thing left worth saying. My daughter gave you 10 years, I said, and a child. You had everything a man could want, and you treated it like a transaction. I picked up my jacket from the chair back. I hope whatever you were reaching for was worth it. I walked out into the December night. The valet stand was lit up near the entrance. Cold air off the Sound came across the parking area in a long, clean sweep. I stood on the stone steps for a moment and breathed it in. My phone buzzed. Emily. Marcus just called me, she said. Her voice was different, lighter, something in it I had not heard in a very long time. Is it done, Dad? It's done, I said. The morning after the Waterford Club dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my legal pad, and the particular quiet of a man who has been moving towards something for a long time and has finally stopped moving. The oak tree outside was bare and still, no wind. The yard looked clean in the December light, the way things look clean after something has been cleared away. My phone did not ring until 9:40. It was George. Ryan received a message this morning, George said. He sounded like a man reporting weather factual, tired, stripped of any remaining capacity for surprise. From Jessica Harmond. She asked him not to contact her again. I held my coffee mug with both hands. How is he? He is sitting in the guest room at our condo, George said. Victoria let him in at 7 this morning. She has been in the kitchen since then, not speaking to anyone. And you, a pause. I am standing on my balcony in 40-degree weather because it is the only place in this home where I can think clearly. A short, humorless sound that was not quite a laugh. Tom Douglas Harmon's office called Ryan's showroom this morning. The Harmon commercial contract, the one that was the foundation of the promotion, has been withdrawn. Ryan's regional director position is under review pending the company's assessment of the situation. I set my mug down. George, I said. I did not set out to take his career. I know that, George said. Ryan set out to build a career on a foundation that could not hold his weight. That is not your doing. He was quiet for a moment. The sound of Westchester traffic 40 feet below him came faintly through the line. Victoria has not spoken to me since Thursday evening. She made coffee this morning and put one cup on the counter and took her own cup to the bedroom and closed the door. I thought about Victoria Carter alone in her bedroom on a December Saturday morning, with her coffee going cold, and the architecture of the last 10 years visible from every angle. How are you, George? I asked. Not about Ryan. Not about the situation. About him. Another pause. Longer. I called that counselor you mentioned, he said finally. I have an appointment on Tuesday. Good, I said. We said goodbye and I set the phone down and sat with the quiet for a while. Emily called at 11. She did not sound lighter the way she had the previous evening. The lightness had settled into something steadier, the difference between relief and resolve. Ryan texted me, she said. He wants to talk. He says Jessica ended things and he realizes now what he had, and he wants to try again. He says the baby deserves a family. I waited. I did not respond, she said. I just wanted you to know. How did it feel? I asked. Reading it, she thought about that for a moment. Like reading a letter addressed to someone I used to be, she said. I kept looking for something in it that moved me. There was nothing there. After we hung up, Sandra came over with a casserole she said she had made too much of, which is what Sandra always says. We ate lunch at my kitchen table and she asked me how I was feeling. Not about Emily, not about Ryan, but about me, and I sat with that question for longer than I expected. Tired, I said finally. And something else I don't have a clean word for yet. Relief, Sandra said. It takes a while to recognize it when you're not used to feeling it. That afternoon, Emily drove to the house on Birchwood Lane to collect the remainder of her personal belongings while Ryan was still at his parents' condo. She called me when she got there. I sat on the line and listened to the sound of her moving through rooms, drawers, opening closet doors, her footsteps on the hardwood floors she had lived on for 6 years. She was quiet for most of it. Then she said, "Dad, they took down the one wedding photo." "Which one?" "Ooh, the one of us. Me and Ryan. From the wall." A pause. "They left all the Carter family pictures. Just took ours down." She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite the opposite. I think Victoria thought that would hurt me, but honestly, it just made it easier to leave. She was back at my house by 4:30 with 2 boxes and a laundry bag and the coleus plant she had kept on the kitchen windowsill for 3 years. She set the plant on my kitchen counter and stepped back and looked at it. "That okay?" she said. "That's fine," I said. "There's good light there in the morning." She nodded. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, her chair the one she had always taken since she was a child, on the left side nearest the window, and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "I'm going to call Margaret Holloway on Monday," she said. "I want to file before Christmas." "Okay," I said. "I want it to be over before the baby comes." She looked up at me. "I want the first thing my child knows to be a house where nobody is pretending." I looked at my daughter sitting in her chair at my kitchen table, 4 months pregnant, both hands flat and steady on the surface, and I felt something move through my chest that was not grief and not pride, but somewhere in the country between them. The particular feeling of watching a person you love find the ground under their feet after a very long fall. "Monday," I said. "I'll drive you." That evening, after Emily had gone upstairs to the room I had prepared for her, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the legal pad in front of me. I turned to the very first page, the page I had filled at 5 in the morning on October 14th, a page full of questions and numbers and the names of people I needed to talk to. I looked at it for a while. Then I closed the pad. Outside the porch, light clicked on automatically. The one Carol had programmed 30 years ago, the one I had never changed, doing its job in the December dark exactly as it always had. I thought she always knew someone would need it. The door at the end of the hallway had been closed for 4 years. Not locked. I never locked it. I just did not open it the way you do not open certain drawers or look at certain photographs or drive down certain roads on certain anniversaries. The room had been Emily's when she was growing up, yellow walls she had chosen herself at 14, a window that faced the backyard and the oak tree, a closet that still held 3 boxes of her childhood things I had never known what to do with. After Emily moved out at 22, Carol had talked about converting it. A sewing room, maybe. A reading room. She never did. And after Carol passed, I found I could not do it either. So the door stayed closed, and I told myself I would get to it eventually, and eventually became 4 years. I opened it the morning of December 8th. The yellow had faded to something softer ivory, almost in the December light coming through the window. The furniture was still there. The twin bed with its maple headboard, the small desk in the corner, the bookshelf with a row of young adult novels Emily had read in middle school and never taken with her. The room smelled of cedar and old paper, and very faintly of the lavender sachets Carol had put in every closet in the house. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went to get cleaning supplies. I spent the morning on it. Dusted the shelves, washed the window, put fresh linens on the bed from the hall closet. Sandra came over at 10 and helped me move the desk to a better position near the window, and carry up the small armchair from the living room that had always been the most comfortable one, and that nobody ever sat in because it was Carol's chair, and we were all, without discussing it, preserving it. "She should have it up here," Sandra said, settling the armchair near the window. "More use than sitting downstairs being protected from." She was right. I did not say so, but she knew. After Sandra left, I went through the closet to make space for Emily's things. That was where I found the box. It was pushed to the back of the top shelf behind a winter blanket I had forgotten I owned. A shoebox, the kind department stores use for dress shoes, with a strip of masking tape on the lid, and Emily's handwriting in blue marker keep. I carried it to the bed and sat down and opened it. Inside was a collection of small things. A birthday card I had made for Emily when she turned 7, a piece of cardboard folded in half, with a drawing of a horse because she had wanted a horse desperately that year and we could not afford one. A photograph of the three of us, Carol, Emily, me, at Rockefeller Center. The Christmas Emily was 9, all of us in winter coats, Emily between us, with both gloved hands holding one of each of ours. A small stuffed rabbit with one eye missing that I did not remember, but that Emily apparently had not been able to throw away. And at the bottom of the box, deflated and slightly dusty, 3 balloons. Pink. The kind you buy in a bag of assorted colors. And beneath them, rolled and held with a rubber band, a paper banner. "Happy Birthday, Emily." Printed on my home printer in the largest font size the paper would accommodate, because I could not find a store-bought banner that said exactly what I wanted. I sat on the edge of the twin bed in my daughter's childhood room and held those deflated balloons in my hands and looked at them for a long time. 3 years ago, I had spent 2 weeks planning that birthday party. I had called Sandra and Dale and 4 of Emily's friends from before the marriage women Ryan had steadily made more difficult for her to see. I had made a grocery list. I had blown up the balloons the morning of, then realized they would deflate by evening, and bought a second bag to blow up later. I had printed the banner and taped it across the kitchen doorway. And then I had sat in this house with Sandra and waited for 2 hours until Sandra gently suggested that perhaps something had come up. Ryan had sent a text at 8:15 that night. "Emily isn't feeling well. Sorry we couldn't make it. She says happy to reschedule." I had texted back, "No problem. Hope she feels better." Because I was trying not to be the kind of father-in-law who caused problems, I had taken the banner down, let the balloons out into the backyard, eaten the grocery store cake alone at the kitchen table while Sandra sat across from me and did not say "I told you so," which was one of the kindest things anyone has ever done for me. I was sitting there with the deflated balloons in my hands when Emily appeared in the doorway. She had come upstairs to tell me the bed frame had a loose leg she had noticed. Practical, forward-moving, that is Emily. She stopped when she saw my face. Then she looked at the balloons. She knew immediately. I could see it, the recognition moving across her face like weather. "Dad," she said. "Is that from your birthday?" I said. 3 years ago. She crossed the room and sat beside me on the edge of the bed. She took one of the deflated balloons from my hand and held it, turning it over slowly. "He told me you were busy," she said. "That he had checked with you and you had a prior commitment." "I was sitting downstairs," I said, "with a cake and Sandra and your friends. For 2 hours." Emily pressed the balloon flat between her palms. Her jaw was set and her eyes were bright, and she breathed through her nose with the steady deliberateness of a woman who has cried enough in the past several weeks to know exactly how to hold it back when she chooses to. "He kept us from each other," she said, "for years, in ways I didn't even see." "Yes," I said. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. We sat like that on the edge of her childhood bed, in the room with the faded yellow walls, while the December light moved across the floor, and the oak tree stood bare and patient outside the window. After a while, she said, "The room looks good, Dad." "There's good light in the morning," I said. She laughed. A real one, short and warm and unguarded. That was the best sound I had heard in a very long time. I drove Emily to Margaret Holloway's office on the morning of December 20th. She was quiet in the passenger seat, the way she is quiet when she has already made her decision and does not need to keep making it. I waited in the hallway outside on a chair beside a small table with a plant on it that was doing considerably better than the one in the waiting room downstairs. 40 minutes. I counted the ceiling tiles. There are 19 of them. When Emily came out, she had a copy of the filed documents in a manila folder under her arm, and the expression of someone who has set down something very heavy and is still feeling the absence of the weight. "Done," I said. "Filed," she said. Margaret says the process takes time, but it's started. We drove to a diner on Mamaroneck Avenue, not the Cornerstone, a different one with no history attached to it. We ordered breakfast at 2 in the afternoon because neither of us had eaten and neither of us cared what time it was. Emily had scrambled eggs and wheat toast. I had the same. She talked about the baby, the due date in April. The name she had been turning over quietly, she did not say it yet, just said she had one in mind. I told her whatever she chose would be right. On the drive home, she fell asleep in the passenger seat before we reached the highway on-ramp. The manila folder was in her lap, her hand resting on top of it, her face completely still. I drove the rest of the way without the radio. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat for a moment before waking her. The porch light was already on. It is always on. I thought about Carol. I thought about 38 years of mornings and the specific sound of her voice before coffee. I thought about the photograph on Emily's nightstand, the one Victoria had left face down, the one Emily had brought home. Then I reached over and touched Emily's shoulder gently. "We're home," I said. She opened her eyes, looked at the porch light, looked at me. "Yeah," she said softly. "We are." The call came at 3:14 in the morning on the 9th of April. I was already awake. I had been awake since 2, sitting in the kitchen with the lights low and a cup of tea gone cold in front of me, which is what happens when you are 68 years old and waiting for something important. Emily's voice was steady and a little breathless. "Dad, it's time." I drove to Westchester Medical Center in 11 minutes. Sandra was in the passenger seat. She had appeared at my door at 2:30 with her coat already on, because Sandra has the particular gift of knowing when she is needed before she is asked. We sat in the waiting room together. Sandra had brought a thermos. I had brought the small stuffed bear I had bought at a gift shop on Mamaroneck Avenue 3 weeks earlier, and then felt embarrassed about and hidden in the coat closet, and then retrieved. At 6:22 in the morning, a nurse came to the doorway. "Mr. Miller, you have a granddaughter." I stood up too fast and had to put my hand on the chair back for a moment. Sandra touched my arm. I walked down the hallway to Emily's room and pushed open the door. Emily was sitting up in the bed. She looked exhausted and completely certain, the way people look when they have just done the hardest thing they have ever done and discovered they were equal to it. She was holding the baby against her chest. A small, red-faced, entirely certain person wrapped in a white hospital blanket. "Dad," Emily said. "Come meet her." I crossed the room, sat in the chair beside the bed. Emily placed her daughter, my granddaughter, into my arms, and I held her, and I did not say anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed saying. By midsummer, they were settled in the room at the end of the hall. The coleus plant on the kitchen counter had grown considerably. There were 2 coffee mugs in the dish rack every morning instead of 1. I still have not changed the porch light timer. I never will. People ask me sometimes what I learned from all of this. I tell them the same thing every time. I learned that silence is not kindness. I spent 12 years telling myself that staying quiet was keeping the peace. The truth is, I was keeping my own comfort, and my daughter paid for it. I learned that love without action is just a feeling. God gave me 2 hands and a lifetime of work. What He wanted from me was never money or revenge. It was simply this: show up. Do not look away. Stay. These are the family stories revenge never announces, not the dramatic kind, with raised voices and broken dishes. The quiet kind. The kind that lives in deflated balloons in a shoebox and a photograph left face down on a sticky note. The kind of family drama revenge that builds slowly in silence until one person decides the silence is over. If you are a parent watching your child disappear into a life that is slowly erasing them, do not wait as long as I did. That is my only regret. I have seen what family drama revenge does when it finally arrives. It does not spare anyone. Choose your child before it comes to that. Choose them loudly. Choose them first. Every family drama revenge story I have ever heard begins the same way: someone stayed quiet too long. This one is no different. Except this time I stopped. This is what family stories revenge looks like when it asks nothing of the law and everything of the truth. If any part of this story touched something real in you, leave a word in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is your sign. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted with care for reflection and the lessons life teaches us. If this kind of story is not for you today, that is completely understood. Choose what speaks to your soul.